What's up guys, Cass here from GiveWave Studios, and on this one I'm going to show you guys how to turn all the parts that you see here into this awesome headdress or tiara or crown, call it whatever you want, but it's from the final episode of WandaVision. Alright, let's get it. Alright, so if you got the patterns from GiveWaveStudios.com or from the Etsy shop, make sure to cut out all of your pieces. The one that I'm putting together right now is for my head, a fairly large size head, so it's best to try everything out in paper form, especially just kind of cut out the base in paper. Try it around your head, make sure it's comfortable, make sure that this piece is not over your ear but right in front or right before your ear starts, because that's going to make it comfortable for you to wear all day. If it's over your ear, it's not going to be as comfortable. Alright, but in order to get this started, one of the first things you're going to want to do, if you got the DIY kit, I will be sending it with this wire, but all this is just like, I believe it's an 18 gauge wire, very similar to what you would get from a hanger that comes from the dry cleaners, which you can use for this application as well if you didn't get a kit but are using your patterns and your own materials. So what we're going to do is lay it down flat on our main piece. For the DIY kits, your pieces will come like this, separate, but all you have to do is just glue these back together, okay? And then glue this on top, wedging this in between, and that's going to allow us to customize the shape of the crown itself and make sure that it holds its shape when we put it on our head. So I'm going to go ahead and fast forward through those steps, and I'll catch you guys for the next one. Do make sure that you get your edges because that's kind of the first place that's going to peel if you don't do this correctly. Okay, grab your piece of wire and you're going to put this right down the center of this piece here across. Okay. This is more or less the position that you want this in. Okay, you don't want it protruding out of the edges. You want like at least, quarter to half an inch on either side here, right? And then when putting these two pieces together, if you got the DIY kit, do remember that your parts are laser cut, which means that the edges of your foam here are burnt. So you want to use a little bit of sandpaper just to expose the foam again and get rid of the char. That way the parts will stick to each other better. Okay, so nothing too complex, as you can see, just a couple of swipes of sandpaper. It could be anything from 120 grit or finer. Okay, and once I have that, I can glue these two pieces together, align this over top, nice and precise, and we are good to start doing the smaller details. Alright, so I'm going to fast forward to this step and catch you guys for the next one. Okay, when you're done with the glue on the other parts, just make sure that these small guys are not sticking to each other, because that's going to be a pain to get them to line up properly if they are. Okay, so we're going to grab our two halves, okay, and glue those together like so. And once we have that, go ahead and grab your base piece and you're going to glue, basically sandwich your metal wire between these two. Okay, being careful to align all of your small pieces as you go around. So you can start from one edge to the other, which is probably going to be the easiest way to do this. As long as you keep this flat, everything should align fairly well. Okay, once you have your part installed, okay, if you want to clean up your seams because they didn't come out all that well, you can definitely use a Dremel at this point, or any type of rotary sander, or just some sandpaper with your finger. Just kind of sand the edges so that they line up flush with each other. And so if you want to correct that, at this point is the step to do that, and you can do that all around with your piece. Okay. Another thing that I want to stress is that where the wire is, you really want to press down left and right of it so that it is completely surrounded and locked in by the top and bottom pieces of foam. That way it doesn't shift around when you start bending this, okay? Because that's the main reason for this, is to be able to form this and it holds its shape, all right? And now you have all of your lines. It's kind of like a little jigsaw puzzle, but I'll go over all of the pieces step by step with you guys, and then we're just going to align our parts and glue them back on. Some of these have very, very pointy tips, and some will be easier to install than others, but we'll go over everything together. So this piece is going to go here, right on top. Okay, so one down. You may find that it's easier to do this with some Gorilla Glue, especially for the parts that get super, super thin. This is a lot easier to work with this stuff. So if you're having trouble with your contact cement, you can definitely use this as an alternative. So now this eyebrow looking piece is next, and that's going to go right here. And this angrier eyebrow piece goes this way, and you can see the mark for it right here. This complex piece is next, and that just goes right here where the two lines are, so follow your paths again. And with this one, it's easier to do this half first. All right, so put your glue down on that half, leave the other half still unglued, and then you can go underneath it and finish the job, because you might get things glued to places that you don't intend to. So just a quick tip as far as this piece is concerned. This green version of the super glue dries in like 15 seconds, so that's if you make a mistake, you have like 0.5 seconds to correct it, but it's also really good in the sense that as soon as you put something down, it's pretty much glued and won't move. So if you're not too confident in your glue placement skills, you can definitely get the blue version of the Gorilla Glue, because that I think has a 30-second dry time. So it's a little bit more forgiving as far as how long you have to correct any mistakes. It just takes a little longer to dry. So you're just going to have to like hold your parts down for longer. Okay? All right, and as you can see, we're left with 1, 2, 3 like swooping lines, and then this piece here, okay, goes in the middle. So we're going to jot that down. This big guy is going to go here on the side. And last but not least, this little guy is going to go right here towards the edge. Okay, and then the only thing left is this little piece that's going to go in the middle. You want to just make it so that it's like a millimeter or two hovering above its base, so that you have a channel as thick as this area here in between the pieces. And then you just repeat the steps for the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and fast forward through those steps and catch you guys for the next one. Okay, and once you've assembled all of your pieces, what you're going to want to do is, while it's still flat, you're going to go in these areas and just kind of sand down and make everything flush. You can even give this area a little bit of a bevel. Try not to bevel these areas too much, because they are fairly thin, and depending on how well you glued them, you might like lift them off of the base that they're on. So just be super careful with the thin parts if you're going to be sanding, especially if you're using a power tool like a rotary sander like this one here. Okay, so you can do this by hand, just by grabbing a piece of sandpaper. Start with maybe like a 80 grit or 120 grit. Just kind of sand it down smooth. Make sure that the you don't feel any ridges here, and then we'll move on to the next step. I'm going to fast forward through this. Okay, so just to give you guys a sense of what it is that I'm doing, you can see here on the inside that this has been smoothed out. I know you can still see the lines, but I don't feel them anymore. Just in comparison, here and here, you can see the lines here, and it's a lot cleaner here. Same thing for if we look at the top here. I cleaned up the top there. Here, not yet, not so much. Just so you guys can see the difference it makes just to sand those edges down a little bit. All right. Okay. So back to the table here. Once all of your edges are sanded and everything is to your liking, you're going to go ahead and grab your heat gun and seal the foam now, especially the edges where you sanded everything, to make sure that the cells get closed. That way when we plasti dip it, we get a nice even layer that we can paint over. So I'm going to go ahead and fast forward through this step. Alright, and if you have any of your tips here that you feel could use a little bit of trimming, like right here for example, I don't really like this edge, so what I'm going to do is grab some small snips and just cut it so that it's a nice and finished edge, as opposed to this double edge that you're seeing here. Kind of cut it flush. And you can do that for as many of the pieces on the inside as well. So this one I'm going to do that going towards the inside, and just trim whatever little edges curled up while we were heat sealing everything. Because sometimes if the very, very fine tips didn't adhere very well to the foam, you will get that little bit of lifting, but that can be remedied with just a small pair of scissors, or just a sharp pair of scissors in general. Pretty much clean. And a couple little snips here and there. So once we have this all cleaned up and all sealed up, I'm going to use my 3D printed head as an example, but you're going to use your own head, because remember, we have a metal rod inside of here that's going to allow us to flex this and turn it around and shape it to our liking. Okay, so what you want to do is get a general sense of what it is on your head, and then just exaggerate that shape a little bit. That way, when you put it on, it fits nice and tight like this. And then if these edges here are flaring up, again, remember I used 3 layers of 3mm. You should only be using a layer of 3mm at the bottom, and then the rest of your detail should be 2mm. That way it's not this thick and doesn't give you this issue. But even with this, I can still heat this up and just shape it a little bit to fit the curve of my face, which is what I'm going to do now. Okay, and now that I found the shape that works for me, okay, I'm going to go ahead and, you guys can tell the difference between this edge here and this one. You see this one is a little bit more tapered. So what I did is I grabbed this piece here and I started from the bottom and cut in a slight curve that ends on the surface. That way it has a nice smooth swoop down. And then it comes down like this. Alright. So now that we have our general shape, we can move on to painting. And we're going to bring this into the paint booth and put some plasti dip on this, and I'll explain the rest of the steps once we're in there. Alright, and for those of you who got the 3D printed DIY kit, or purchased the STL so you can 3D print it yourself, so this is more or less, you know, what a regular print looks like off of the print bed. And you'll notice here that you can see the print lines. You can even hear them while I scratch at them here. But here, quiet. Right? All because I just sanded this down. I started with an 80 grit, then so went to a 120, and then finished up with a 500. So it has a nice smooth surface that our paint will adhere to. Right? So the difference between the EVA foam version that we're doing and the 3D printed version is that we will not be putting any plasti dip on our 3D printed part. We're just going to maybe do some filler primer, sand one more time, and then just apply our base color, whether it be acrylic with an airbrush or some sort of spray paint that you can get at your local Lowe's or Home Depot. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat up my 3D printed part. I'm going to use my head to mold the part around. Don't do this on your skin directly. If you do want to do this on yourself, I don't suggest doing it, but if you do not heed my words, at least wrap your head with some type of bandana so that the heated part doesn't make direct contact with your skin. That way you avoid burning yourself. So the best way for you to do this is to either have some type of mannequin head that you can wrap this around, or maybe just do it around a soda bottle, okay? And then if it's too tight, heat it up, loosen it up, open up the curve a little bit until it fits you exactly the way that it needs to. Alright, so as you guys can see, I used a couple of mouse sanders to get the majority of this sanded down, which ended up taking me probably less than 5 minutes. Obviously, if you were doing this by hand, it'd probably take you a little longer, maybe like 30 to 45 minutes to sand it down nice and smooth. And of course, the machines are no substitute for hand sanding your stuff. So even with the machines, the final pass here, I'm still going to do by hand. I believe this is a 500 grit. So I'm just going to go ahead and clean this up, make it nice and smooth. So once you're done with your hand sanding, you might notice there are certain lines that you just can't get to. That's perfectly fine. What you want is just to make those lines as fine as possible. So what will end up happening is once we do our first pass of filler primer on this, that paint is going to seep into this microscopic creases, and then that will give us the perfect finish that we need so that we can finish this. But before we do that, we need to shape this. So we're going to go have our heat gun. And if you do about 22 seconds on the front, 22 seconds on the back, you'll see we have a nice softened 3D printed part here. And then we put that on the head or the tube that you're using, and you are just holding it in place so that it can cool down in the shape that you want it to stay in. So I'm going to use my big old hands and just use that. Make sure that the wings on the side here don't cave in too much. And it's okay to reheat this and restart over as many times as you would like until you get the proper shape. So now that I have it generally, I can take it off of the head or whatever shape that I'm using to mold it on. And from what I could visually see when I was shaping it, maybe I saw that the cheeks weren't going in as much as I wanted to. So I can just kind of force that at the last minute as it's cooling so that it kind of holds that general shape. So once you've sanded your 3D printed part, then you can shape this, and any other sanding that we'll do after we do our filler primer will be done with the general shape here. So if I go back on my big old head, I place it, and you'll notice that it is where it needs to be. And this is our general shape. I'm happy with this, so we can go ahead and take this to the paint booth. Okay, we're in our paint booth, so we're going to do filler primer on our 3D printed part as our base coat. This is from Rust-Oleum. It's filler and sandable. Okay, and then for our EVA foam version, we're going to use some Plasti-Dip as our base coat before we apply our top coat. All right, so we're going to go ahead and spray these two guys separately. Once that dries, I'll show you guys which color I use, and then we'll go into weathering and putting on a strap, and we'll be done. Alright, so our parts are dry on both of these. So for the EVA foam one, we're going to do at least 1 or 2 more coats of Plasti-Dip just to kind of build up the surface a little bit. But in between the first and the second coat for our 3D printed one, we're going to sand it down so that these little lines that we were talking about here, so if I do a little bit of this here, You can use the filler primer to fill those gaps a little bit. And as you can see, that close that off nicely. So we're going to do that for the entirety of the surface before we do our second coat. So we've gone from streaky lines to small little holes that are going to get filled automatically with the next couple of coats of paint that we're going to be doing. Alright, so that's really all this process was to just kind of fill in the big gaps on the surface part of the build here. If you want to get rid of the lines that are deeper in here, you just have to pool your paint in here a little bit. Maybe when you start weathering it, just add a little bit more of acrylic, and then that might just get rid of those. But as far as like the sanding is concerned, you're really focusing on the elevated parts, not so much the sunken parts in here. All right, and then we'll just continue with our second coats, and then we'll move on to proper paint. Okay, and with both of our pieces prepped to our liking, we're going to grab some of this paint and primer. This is a gloss paint. If you can find something similar, or maybe even a little darker than this, and maybe like a satin or a matte finish, it's probably better for this, because her costume, or even the headdress here, is not very shiny. It's a very matte, dull finish, but I'm going to be going over this when it's done with a satin clear coat, so that it kind of dulls the shine a little bit. So we're just going to go ahead and paint this up. Okay, so with both of our pieces painted, now all we have to do is go on the inside here with a color burgundy that's slightly darker than the base color that we used. So I'm using this burgundy from Angelus. You guys can use whichever color you'd like. I'm going to mix a little bit of black with it, so that it gives me something that's a little bit more like this. So yeah, and then I'm just going to paint these inner details on both of these pieces, and we can just put a strap on these and call it. Okay, and we have both of our crowns, our EVA and our 3D printed one, looking just as good as each other. And what I'm going to do at this point is do a little bit of airbrushing on the surface with the darker burgundy that I have here, and because it's an acrylic, it's going to dull the shine that I have on the surface of both of these. Again, if you had used a matte color to begin with, you wouldn't have to do this step, or if you like the color combination that you currently have, you can just seal everything with a matte colored clear acrylic. Alright, on to the next step. So I did about half, so you guys can get a sense of the difference that the final airbrush pass that I'm doing here is making. It's just dulling that scarlet red. This is kind of bright compared to here, so it dulls it a little bit and just kind of melds it a little nicer with the rest of the darker patches that we did on the inside there. And that's basically what I'm doing. I'm going to do that for both of them. Alright, and once you are done and you are satisfied with your paint job, go ahead and measure out how much elastic you need to keep this on your head. And you can get your elastic waistband in whichever color or width you prefer. If you don't want to do an elastic waistband, I'm pretty sure you can attach like a hair clip or something like that on the inside that allows you to wear this without. And if you did print out the version that has the tabs there, that makes it even easy. You don't even have to use glue. You can just tie this in a knot there and use your piece. So I'm just going to go ahead and do it for this guy. And then once you've glued it to the inner side, just put a little bit of glue over top here also. Just kind of wedge it down and make sure that that doesn't escape eventually. So, alright, with that done, go ahead and put this on myself, and voila, we have our Scarlett Witch crown on. And and it looks great. It's as if you guys were looking at a spitting image of me. Alright, so this has been Cass from GiveWave Studios. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I hope this one was useful. If you purchase the patterns, the STL 3D printable file, or the 3D printed DIY kits, I appreciate the support. Alright, so yeah, I will catch you guys on the next one. Cheers.